Evolutionism and Darwinism are emphatically not the same thing. Darwinism is a form of evolutionism that arose only in the mid-19th century. Evolutionism, as we have seen, goes much farther back, maybe even to the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, that is, if you believe Anaxagoras anticipated Darwinism. For most of medieval history, evolutionism wasn't really much of a thing. Then the world was dominated by the Platonic idea of nature, ever striving towards the perfection of the ideal. And from that perspective, evolution is an alien idea. Evolution implies change, and how can perfection change? All that began to shift in the 17th and 18th centuries, and this is when evolutionism, as we conceive it today, began to emerge. What changed was a new conception that the universe was changeable. Things that had at one time seemed perfection embodied now were anything but. Among these was a growing realization that species were not constant things. The discovery of fossil organisms demonstrated that living things existed in the past that were not like living things that exist in the present. Species changed over time. Living things evolved. There had to be some explanation for this, and among the first to provide an explanation were two remarkable French naturalists. They were Jean-Baptiste Pierre-Antoine de Monnet, Chevalier de Lamarck, who we now refer to simply as Lamarck, and, well, I won't even try to pronounce the name, this man, whose name is familiar to us as Georges Cuvier, or simply Cuvier. Lamarck and Cuvier were contemporaries, but of different generations, with Cuvier being about 25 years younger than Lamarck. Both men were among the first explicit evolutionary thinkers, bringing a perspective of change to things previously thought to be immutable, like species. They were, to coin a phrase, the French evolution. We don't often give them the attention they deserve because both are often painted today as mere precursors to Darwinism, as if Darwin was the sun toward which evolutionism was inevitably drawn. In Darwin's own words, the main debt we supposedly owe to Lamarck and Cuvier is that they put the idea of evolution into the air, so to speak. Once the Darwinian sun rose, though, both Lamarck and Cuvier were eclipsed, or so the story goes. This does neither man justice. Treating Lamarck and Cuvier as mere precursors to Darwin has fostered a tendency to caricature the evolutionary thought of both Lamarck and Cuvier. Lost in the caricature is the most interesting dimension to their stories. Lamarck and Cuvier both were vitalists, but their careers were bracketed by the transition between metaphysical vitalism and process vitalism that we addressed in the previous lecture. Specifically, Lamarck was a metaphysical vitalist, while Cuvier was more of a process vitalist. To understand either man, this transition needs to be taken into account. So, we'll spend a bit of time filling in their stories. We'll consider Lamarck in this lecture and Cuvier in the next. Hi, thanks for visiting. I'm glad you're here. We'll return to the video in a few seconds, but I'd like to say something first. This video series is based upon my recent book, Purpose and Desire. I wrote this book in part because I'm frustrated with our public discourse about evolution, how we think about it, what it means, how we teach young people about it. This is an important conversation for us to have, yet we're really not having it. Our public conversation about evolution has been stuck in the same fruitless place for nearly a century, since the Scopes trial, basically. Why should this be? Well, I've been thinking about this for a long time now, too, and I've concluded it's because we've been thinking about evolution incorrectly, coincidentally, for about a century now. That's why I wrote Purpose and Desire, and it's why I'm producing this series. Do you feel the same way? Or do you disagree vehemently? Great, let's start a conversation. Drop me a line. Visit my website. subscribe to my YouTube channel. It'll be fun. Okay, thanks for listening. On to the video. Lamarck was very much an Enlightenment thinker. Here's the thing about the Enlightenment, though. A lot of medieval ideas lasted well into the Enlightenment. For Lamarck, one of the most influential of these medieval holdovers was a concept known as the Great Chain of Being, also known as the Scala Naturae. The Great Chain of Being was a very Platonic idea. You can see this through this beautiful woodcut taken from Diego Valdez's 1579 work, the Rhetorica Christiana. In the Great Chain of Being, nature was organized into a hierarchy of perfection, with the perfection of God standing in polar opposition to the demons and fallen angels of hell. Nature was governed by an ongoing striving toward the perfection of the divine. Some aspects of nature were farther along on this than others, with the result being a hierarchy. Within the hierarchy, various living things found a natural place, with mud and the elements at the bottom, and above this were progressively more highly organized forms of life, culminating in human beings and then the saints. To the medieval mind, the Great Chain of Being said two things about nature. First, it recognized that there was a wide range of complexity of living things, ranging from the simplest, most mindless worm up to the apex of creation, man. Second was the seeming adaptability of the living world to conform to the diverse environments in which they lived. Fish had fins because they lived in water, while animals had legs to stride over the ground. This was the foundation of medieval natural history as well as natural theology. Lamarck was born to an impoverished family of minor French nobility in Picardy, in the north of France. As a young man, he began to study medicine, but he soon left that to enroll in the French army to fight in the 7 Years' War. There, he showed great bravery as a soldier, and in recognition of this, he was awarded a royal pension, which enabled him to return to his studies, which soon landed him in the scientific environment in Paris, where he flourished. He initially pursued an interest in plants, and was soon elected to the French Academy of Sciences, eventually becoming curator of plants at the Royal Botanical Garden, the Jardin du Roi. Shortly thereafter came the French Revolution, deposing the monarchy, and with it Lamarck's royal patron. We all know what happened next. And to keep his head, Lamarck then rechristened the Royal Botanical Garden as a public botanical garden, the Jardin des Plantes, which still exists in Paris today. Along the way, he broadened his interest to include invertebrates, stimulated by the increasingly rich fossil record that was building up then. He then became a professor of zoology. Lamarck was someone we would call a system builder. He sought to build an explanatory framework, a system that would encompass nature in its totality. This would include not only the physical world, geology, mineralogy, meteorology, chemistry, as well as life. As a minor footnote, Lamarck is credited with coining the term biology and describing himself as a biologist. So it is to Lamarck that we owe the foundation of life as a distinct discipline from natural history. The Great Chain of Being was an important part of Lamarck's thinking. His knowledge of fossils convinced him there had to be more to the Great Chain of Being than a simple striving toward a Platonic ideal. The fossil record was showing quite clearly that animals had existed in the past that did not resemble any animal living today. And there was evidence that animals living today, including man, did not exist in the past. How to explain that? Let's summarize Lamarck's system for explaining the Great Chain. We'll take 6 examples of organisms, ranging in complexity from plants up through worms and arthropods to vertebrates to mammals, and culminating in the most complex animal, man. It's going to get a little complicated from here, so we'll just use labeled color-coded circles to represent them. We're going to follow the fates of these organisms through time. At the present time, all 6 will be lined up in a row. Lamarck thought that each type of present-day organism was the product of the striving of past organisms towards higher complexity. Let's look first at present-day worms, represented by the brown circle. To Lamarck, these represented a higher order of complexity compared to plants. Present-day worms, therefore, had to have arisen from a less complex creature in the past, such as plants. What about arthropods, represented with the red circle? These had to have arisen from less complex species in the past, such as a primitive species of worm. These, in turn, had to have emerged in the more distant past from a yet more primitive species of plants, say. We can do this for every level of complexity that we see presently. So, for example, present-day vertebrates, represented by the orange circle, had to have arisen from an earlier species of, say, arthropods, which themselves had to have emerged from still earlier forms of worms, and so forth for all. So, Lamarck thought that present-day species represented a line of evolution from more primitive and less complex creatures, increasing in complexity with time. This was Lamarck's explanation for the great chain of being. To get away from the notion of the Platonic striving toward perfection, Lamarck explained the great chain of being by invoking 2 vital forces. The first was a vital force which drove life continuously towards higher and higher complexity. He called this the complexifying force. This complexifying force not only could explain the past, it could make predictions for the future. Present-day arthropods, for example, might give rise to primitive forms of vertebrates in the future. The complexifying force also ensured new lineages would emerge continuously by creating simple life out of inanimate matter, so-called spontaneous generation. Lamarck thought that the complexifying force could not be the only vital force operating on lineages. If it were complexifying force alone, you would expect, for example, that past vertebrates would look just like vertebrates living in the present. The emerging fossil record showed that this was not true. Mammals living in the past could be identified from fossils, and these looked different from mammals living in the present. So, Lamarck proposed another vital force, the so-called adaptive force, which translates more closely as the influence of the environment. Adaptation was well known in Lamarck's time. Fur grew thicker in the cold, muscles grew stronger as they worked, and so forth. By the end of the 18th century, it was also becoming clear that the environment had a history as well. Europe was just emerging from the Little Ice Age, for example, and this climate change was a part of everyone's lived experience. Lamarck wanted to account for this as well. Let's illustrate this by focusing on just 2 lineages, the one leading toward man and the one leading toward less complex mammals. Let's look first at the supposed mammalian ancestors to present-day man. If the environment then was different from the present day, the adaptive force would reshape those mammalian ancestors into a different form. More to the point, that form would be different from present-day mammalian creatures. The same applies to the vertebrate ancestors of present-day mammals. Again, the adaptive force would reshape those vertebrate ancestors into a form more suited for their contemporaneous conditions. In the meantime, the vertebrate ancestors in the lineage towards man would likewise be shaped by the environment of their time, so that vertebrates then would be different from the later mammalian vertebrate ancestors. I hope you get the idea. Every ancestor will be shaped by the peculiarities of their contemporaneous environments, and it's the adaptive force that would do the reshaping. The end result will be ancestors that differ over time. Rather than a straight ramp up to ever higher complexity, lineages will evolve over a convoluted path shaped continuously by the adaptive force. When you read about Lamarck today, his name is usually associated with something called the inheritance of acquired characters. This even has a name, Lamarckism. That's a bit of a caricature, so let's take it apart a little. Lamarckism is usually illustrated with the story of how giraffes got their long necks. Supposedly, ancestral giraffes repeatedly strained their necks to reach succulent leaves at the tops of trees. Nobody believes this anymore, by the way. The point is, Lamarck thought so. And in doing so, the necks of these ancestors became ever so slightly longer over an animal's lifetime. This was the acquired character, although we should more properly describe this as an adaptation. To Lamarck, elongation of the neck was the adaptive force at work, through what Lamarck called the law of use and disuse. In this notion, parts of the body that were used during an animal's lifetime would grow stronger, longer, and stouter, what have you. The giraffe stretches its neck, and its neck becomes longer. On the other hand, parts of the body that were not used would grow weaker, shorter, smaller, etc. This was disuse, as when cave dwellers, like this blind cavefish, lost their eyes altogether. Here's where inheritance of acquired characters comes in. The ever so slightly longer neck or the ever so slightly smaller eyes in one generation would then be passed on to the offspring. And over many generations of use and disuse, combined with the inheritance of its consequences, the necks of giraffes would progressively elongate until you had, voila, giraffes with long necks, or voila, fish with no eyes. If we set aside all the antiquated language and invocation of supposed vital forces, Lamarck's ideas are really not so outlandish. In fact, for his time, it was pretty much conventional wisdom. Adaptation is a real thing. Everyone then knew about it, and everyone was trying to get a handle on what it was and how it worked. That was the whole point of the debate around the transition from metaphysical vitalism to process vitalism. Lamarck's thinking developed in the midst of that debate, and he was still very much steeped in the conventional ideas of vital forces. In fact, his idea of an adaptive force takes a page from the vis mediatrix we discussed in a previous lecture. Nor was Lamarck's complexifying force all that original. Something like a complexifying force had long been thought to operate during embryonic development. Complexifying force supposedly was behind how a complex organism could be formed from the supposedly formless mass of an egg. In terms of the workings of the organism, he was very conventional in his view that both an adaptive force and a complexifying force worked to shape the organism. And the same supposedly could be said about any organism in the past and any likely descendants into the future. So, what was original about Lamarck that we should take him seriously? Here's what made him interesting. In addition to the adaptive and complexifying forces operating on organisms, Lamarck argued that they also shaped the lineal relationships between generations. In other words, the same vital forces that shaped organisms could also shape lineages. That's what was original about Lamarck. Lamarck was therefore the first person to develop a coherent theory for evolution. Development, adaptation, and heritability all could be shaped by the adaptive and complexifying forces. Each turn of the cycle of development, adaptation, and reproduction would produce a new generation, and out of this continual turning would emerge evolution of a new lineage. That was Lamarck's revolutionary idea. Phew, that's pretty complicated. Let's try and get back to the basic question. Why should we take Lamarck and his system seriously? Lamarckism is enjoying a bit of a renaissance lately, so this is not simply a question of historical arcana. We'll come back to this Lamarckian renaissance later. When we do, we should have a complete understanding of him. That's why we should take Lamarck and what he thought seriously. Lamarck was a tragic figure in many ways, and his thinking has been subject to a lot of ridicule, misrepresentation, and reduction to caricature. We want to avoid that here. In evaluating Lamarck, it's important that we realize that he was a man of his times. He was immersed in the whole language of metaphysical vitalism, and that's why he relied so strongly on vital forces in his system. He was also beholden to a concept, the great chain of being, that has likewise fallen out of fashion. In other words, he lived in a time and spoke an intellectual language that was very different from our own. We should take care not to dismiss him because he did not conform to the standards of our own times. To do so is a little bit like dismissing someone because their command of the English language is not very good. So there's that. There's also the system of his system-building tendencies, as we mentioned. Lamarck was a complex thinker who was drawn to complexity as a moth is to a flame. That's evident in the complexity of his evolutionary system. Unfortunately, it's the curse of the complex thinker often to be misunderstood, reduced to caricature, and sometimes ridiculed. As we shall soon see, this was Lamarck's fate. Again, we have to ask, is it fair to judge someone's intellect by the standards of his most severe critics? I don't think it is, and I expect that you won't either. Having said all that, let's try to evaluate Lamarck's thinking more objectively, so that we can see what was truly innovative and what that might say about how we think about evolutionism today. Lamarck's real innovation, to me, was his proposal that the same forces that shaped organisms could shape lineages of organisms as well. In this sense, Lamarck has to be credited with the first coherent and comprehensive theory of evolution. It happened to be framed in a language and a philosophical context that is unpopular today, even uncomfortable. Now, it needs to be said that coherency and comprehensiveness do not necessarily give you a correct theory. There's a lot to criticize in Lamarck's thinking, to be sure, and we'll be doing so as we go along. But we should always hope to frame that criticism in terms of what Lamarck actually thought, rather than the caricature of Lamarck that is so common today.